Well, good Saturday afternoon. My name is Jay Thompson. I am the teaching pastor here at Simply Church, and I'm excited to have you be a part of our series as we're kicking off looking at all of the letters that Paul wrote in the New Testament from now until Easter. And this week what we've done is we've kind of taken a little bit of a dive into Paul's life, and we're asking some questions. What are some takeaways that we can get from his life? What are some principles and practices that we can all begin to understand and apply to our lives? And so shared a couple of those 2 days ago, and I wanted to share three short ones today before we starting next week. What we're going to do is start from a chronological standpoint of going through the letters that Paul wrote. And so we will start next week, and I'll challenge you next week to begin to read through 1 Thessalonians. And we're going to be talking about some things that we can begin to take away and apply from our lives, from that letter that he wrote to the church in Thessalonica. But today I just want to kind of look back at Paul's life. And we talked about in Paul's life that we understand that, our past doesn't have to define us. We understand that no one is too far from being able to receive God's grace, and that he can use anybody. God can use anybody to accomplish what he wants in and through our life. He's not looking for perfect people, but he's looking for willing and available people who are willing first to recognize their need for Jesus and then turn the control of their life over to Jesus. And so what we're going to see right now, I'm going to read a couple passages, and I'm going to start in Philippians chapter 4, verses 11 through 13. And this is one of the most familiar passages. One of the verses in this passage is one of the most familiar that's associated with Paul. But I want you to listen to what he said. He said this in Philippians chapter 4, verses 11 through 13. He says, "Not that I've ever been in need, for I have learned how to be content with whatever I have. I know how to live with almost nothing, and I know what it's like to live with everything." He says, "I have learned the secret of living in every situation, whether it is with a full stomach or an empty one, whether it was plenty or with little. Here's verse 13, for I can do all things, everything, through Christ who gives me strength." And oftentimes when we hear that passage, we think about these incredibly big things that God wants and can do in our life, and that I can do anything that he calls me to do. But Paul set this up that it's not about those big things. He reminded us of this, that I can do all things, the good times, the bad times, the hungry times, the plenty times. I can do all of those things in my life, not because of my own strength, but because of Christ's strength that he gives me. So what does that mean for me and you today? I think it really revolves around one word, and that word is contentment. Contentment. Am I okay with where I am, who I am, and who God has laid out for me to be? Am I content in that? In other words, do I trust God that he has everything in control? I wrote down a takeaway from Paul's life and related to this passage in Philippians chapter 4 is that contentment is not based on the circumstances that I am in, but contentment is based on who I am within my circumstances. It's not about what you're going through. It's about who you are when you go through those things. That's what contentment is I've got to be okay with me. I've got to be okay with who God has called me to be. We were talking on the way back from a birthday party today. Me and Mandy and my daughter Bethany were talking, and one of those things that a lot of kids get asked. We were at my granddaughter Aubrey's, one of her cousins had her 2-year-old birthday party today, and we talked about this, that kids get asked this question so many times in their life. What do you want to be when you grow up? What do you want to be? What kind of job do you want to have? Do you want to be a fireman? Do you want to be a dancer? Do you want to be a baseball player? Do you want to be a doctor? What do you want to be when you grow up? And the most important question is not what do you want to be. Really, the most important question that Paul answers right here is not what do you want to be, but who do you want to be in your life? Who do you want to be? Because here's what I have found, and Paul would tell you this as well. Who you are in life travels with you to all the what's that you do in life. And the thing that's consistent in all of your circumstances and situations is you. The same thing in my life. And Paul said, I have learned to be content in all of those. I think we can take a great lesson from Paul as well. In the book, the letter that he wrote to the church in Galatia, he wrote there in Galatians chapter 1, verse 10, it says this. It says, I'm not trying to win the approval. He says, obviously, I'm not trying to win the approval of people, but of God. If pleasing people were my goal, I would not be Christ's servant. Wow. If you want to know what Paul's life was, this is that he would say this, that we need to live our lives to please God and not try to please other people. And when we think about pleasing other people, that includes ourselves, us. Paul said this, I don't live and do, say, go, think in a way to gain approval of people. I do that to make sure, first and foremost, I am approved by God. In other words, he says this, my obedience, my actions are going to be influenced because it's going to accomplish what God is calling and leading me to do in my life. A couple of quotes that I read this week were pretty phenomenal. It says, when we put God first, let me start over. When we put God first, all of the things fall into the proper place or day in our lives. Our love of the Lord will govern the claims for our affection, the demands for our time, the interests that we pursue, and the order of our priorities. When we put God first, the other things in our life fall into place. A.W. Tozer said this, says, we are called not to adjust ourselves to each other, but to adjust ourselves to God. Man, we're here at the beginning of the year. New Year's resolutions, things that we want to either maybe stop, things we want to start, maybe things that we want to continue to do in a great way. The question I would ask is this, is why? If it's because you're seeking God's approval with those things, get after it. But if it's for us to look better to other people, we may need to step back and ask ourselves, is this the right pursuits that we need to be doing in our life? So Paul says this, be content. You know what? Your circumstances should not determine your contentment, but who you are in your circumstances will show your contentment. That we live for God's approval and not man's. Last I want to share from Paul's life is this. In Acts chapter 16, verse 6, you're going to hear a short little word that is used so often with Paul, and that is and. It says, Paul and his companions traveled through the region of Galatia. Paul and fill in the blank. There were so many men and women that Paul did life together with. Paul did whatever in life that he was calling, whether he was on the mission field, whether he was building tents, whether he was preaching in a synagogue. It was always Paul and. Now I wrote this down, is that we should not do life alone. God has not called us to do this Christian life alone. We need to be us and other people. So I'll leave you with this thought. Yes, accepting Jesus is a personal decision, but following after Jesus is best when we do it together. So I want to encourage you over the next few months, join us on this journey as we begin to search and seek after the Lord in the letters that Paul wrote. And you know what? If we'll do this together, we're going to find that we're going to grow closer to one another, grow closer to the Lord, and take steps to accomplish what he wants to do in and through our lives. If you have some questions about what it means to follow Jesus, have a journey with him, go to our website, scroll down to the bottom, simplychurch.online, scroll down to the bottom, and you can find a contact or connect kind of card there. Fill out your information, and I would love to follow up with you and share what that means. What does it look like? Maybe something I can pray with you about in your journey with Jesus. So hope today's words have encouraged you and challenged you. And maybe we can be, as Paul said this in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 1, Paul said this. He says, if you imitate me, you're going to be imitating Christ. So if we're going to follow the example of Paul, Paul said you're going to be following the example of Jesus. So I encourage you, start taking steps to become the men and women that God wants us to be. Take the steps that Paul made. And you know what? You're going to find that you're going to be stepping toward Jesus. Hope that encourages you. Next week, we'll be jumping into 1 Thessalonians. So go ahead and get ready. Read through that book. Maybe read through that once a day. Short book that you can read through. And let's talk about some principles and practices that we can all apply to our lives. Hope you have a great weekend. And I'll talk to you next week.